Bavaria, May 1945. The war was 3 days dead when Private James Sullivan from Brooklyn walked into a bombed-out apartment in Munich and found the woman and her daughter hiding in a closet, starving, terrified of what conquering soldiers might do. He'd been told Germans were the enemy, monsters who'd started this catastrophe. Instead, he saw a mother clutching a child, both of them thin as ghosts, eyes holding fear so absolute it made his hands shake. He set down his rifle and opened his ration pack. Germany in May 1945 was a country that had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Cities were moonscapes of rubble. Infrastructure was shattered. The economy had collapsed. Millions were displaced, homeless, wandering through ruins, looking for family members who might be alive, might be dead, might simply be gone into the chaos that stretched from the Baltic to the Alps. The women bore the heaviest burden of defeat. German men were dead, missing, or imprisoned. Estimates varied, but perhaps 3 million military dead, millions more in prisoner of war camps, scattered across the Soviet Union, France, Britain, America. The women remained mothers, daughters, wives, widows, suddenly responsible for survival, in conditions that made survival seem impossible. Food was scarce. The rationing system had collapsed. The official daily calorie allotment in the British zone was 1,050 calories starvation level. The French zone was worse. Even the American zone, comparatively generous, provided barely enough to sustain life. Women foraged in forests, traded family heirlooms for potatoes, did whatever necessary to keep children alive. Housing was catastrophic. Allied bombing campaigns had been thorough. 70% of housing destroyed in major cities. Hamburg was rubble. Cologne was rubble. Berlin was rubble so complete it defied description. Dresden, once called the Florence of the Elbe, was ash and memory. Millions lived in cellars, in ruins, in makeshift shelters that offered protection from weather, but nothing else. Into this landscape of devastation came the occupation forces. The American soldiers who arrived in Germany in spring 1945 came as conquerors, not liberators. There was a crucial distinction. In France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, American forces had been welcomed, celebrated, kissed by grateful civilians who'd endured years of occupation. In Germany, they were victors entering enemy territory, enforcing surrender, implementing policies designed to prevent Germany from ever threatening the world again. The official policy was non-fraternization. Orders were explicit. No social contact with German civilians. No conversations beyond military necessity. No friendships. No relationships. Certainly no romance. Germans were to be treated with professional distance, reminded constantly of their collective guilt, denied the comfort of human connection with their conquerors. The policy lasted about 3 weeks. Private James Sullivan was 22, from Brooklyn, a clerk before the war who'd been drafted in 1943, trained in Texas, shipped to England, then France, then through the Siegfried Line into Germany itself. He'd seen combat not extensive, but enough to carry images that would never fade. He'd helped liberate a camp near Buchenwald, had walked through evidence of crimes so enormous they broke the mind trying to comprehend them. He arrived in Munich in May with his unit, the 45th Infantry Division, assigned to occupation duty in what would become the American zone. The city was barely recognizable as a city, more like an archaeological ruin, layers of destruction piled atop each other, streets lined with facades that fronted nothing but air. His unit was billeted in a building that had somehow survived mostly intact, a rare exception in a neighborhood otherwise reduced to rubble. They were tasked with maintaining order, processing civilians, distributing rations, enforcing curfew, being the visible presence of American authority. The non-fraternization order felt wrong to James from the start. He'd grown up in a neighborhood of immigrants, Italians, Irish, Polish Jews, where people helped each other, because that's what people did. The idea of seeing suffering and walking past it, of denying common humanity because of orders, conflicted with everything his mother had taught him about decency and compassion. On his third day in Munich, he encountered Anna Becker. She was 26, a schoolteacher before the war, now just another survivor in a city of survivors. Her husband had died on the Eastern Front in 1943. Her parents had died in an air raid in 1944. She lived with her 7-year-old daughter Maria in what remained of her family's apartment, 2 rooms with a partially collapsed ceiling, windows covered with cardboard, furniture long since burned for heat. James found them during a routine patrol through his assigned sector. He'd heard crying from a building that appeared abandoned, investigated out of concern for possible injured civilians, climbed stairs through rubble to find Anna and Maria hiding in a closet. The terror in their eyes was absolute. Anna stood in front of her daughter, arms spread as if her thin frame could provide protection. She didn't speak English. James didn't speak German. They stared at each other across a gulf of language and propaganda and war. James slowly set down his rifle, raised his hands to show they were empty, smiled as gently as he could. Easy, easy now. I'm not going to hurt you. The words meant nothing to Anna, but the tone did. The body language did. The fact that he'd put down his weapon did. She couldn't relax. That would take weeks, but the absolute terror receded fractionally. James pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket. K-ration issue, something he'd been saving. He held it out, made eating gestures, pointed to the little girl. For her. For the child. Maria looked at her mother. Anna looked at James, trying to calculate if this was trick or trap or genuine kindness. Hunger made the decision. She nodded to Maria, who crept forward, snatched the chocolate with hands so quick they blurred, retreated immediately. James smiled, pulled out his remaining rations, crackers, cheese, tinned meat, set them on the floor between them, backed toward the door. His unit would notice if he was gone too long. He pointed to the food, pointed to them, tried to communicate. This is for you. I'm leaving it. Anna watched him leave, didn't move toward the food until his footsteps faded down the stairs. Then she and Maria fell on it like wolves, eating with hands in desperation, crying while they chewed because they hadn't tasted food like this in months. James returned the next day with more rations. The next day again. Always the same routine: knock softly, wait for recognition, leave food, depart quickly. He violated non-fraternization orders with each visit, but rationalized it as humanitarian necessity. They were starving. He had food. The calculation was simple. By the 4th visit, Anna had learned to say thank you in English. James had learned Danke in German. They still barely spoke. Language remained a barrier, but communication expanded through gestures and smiles in the universal language of gratitude. On the 6th visit, James brought a medic from his unit, a German-American named Fisher, whose family had emigrated to Pennsylvania in the 1920s. Fisher could translate, could bridge the gap properly. Through him, James learned Anna's story teacher, widow, mother, survivor of a city that had tried to destroy itself fighting to the end. Anna learned James's story clerk, draftee, decent man from Brooklyn who'd seen terrible things but hadn't let them make him terrible, who believed in helping people even when orders said otherwise, who saw her as a person rather than as an enemy. The medic examined Maria, found her malnourished but not critically so, provided vitamins and advice about what food to prioritize. He examined Anna, found bruising on her arms that she wouldn't explain, warned about diseases spreading through the refugee populations, encouraged her to register for official rations once the distribution system was established. After the medic left, Anna and James sat in the damaged apartment and attempted conversation through broken phrases and hand gestures. The effort was awkward, humorous, surprisingly connecting. They laughed actual laughter at their mutual linguistic incompetence, at the absurdity of trying to communicate complex thoughts through pantomime. That laughter felt revolutionary. It meant they could be human together, could share a moment of lightness in darkness so complete that light seemed impossible. James would remember it later as the moment he understood that the war had been about preventing something evil, but the peace would be about building something good, and building required connection, required seeing people as people rather than as categories or enemies. He was not alone in this recognition. Across occupied Germany, similar scenes played out thousands of times daily. American soldiers encountered German civilians in circumstances that made ideological purity impossible to maintain. The official non-fraternization policy collided with human reality and shattered on impact. In Frankfurt, Corporal Robert Hayes from Ohio helped an elderly woman carry water from a functioning well to her cellar apartment. She reminded him of his grandmother. The resemblance was so strong it hurt. He couldn't walk past her struggling with buckets when he could carry them easily. Couldn't maintain professional distance when she looked at him with his grandmother-esque eyes and thanked him in a language he did not understand, but whose gratitude was universal. In Stuttgart, Sergeant Thomas Wheeler from Virginia spent his off-duty hours repairing a school that had been damaged by artillery. The children needed education. Someone had to fix the building. He had carpentry skills from growing up on a farm. The logic was simple enough to override orders about fraternization. In Heidelberg, Lieutenant David Morrison from California found himself mediating disputes between German civilians' arguments about property lines, about ration distribution, about whose turn it was to use the communal cooking facilities in apartment buildings where individual kitchens no longer functioned. He was supposed to maintain order. Order required some level of engagement with the people being ordered. By June 1945, the non-fraternization policy was effectively dead, even if officially still enforced. General Eisenhower recognized reality, began relaxing restrictions incrementally. Soldiers could speak to German children, who were innocent victims after all. Then they could speak to all civilians for work-related purposes. Then social contact became permissible in limited contexts. By September, the policy was formally abandoned, replaced with guidelines about appropriate behavior rather than absolute prohibitions. The military brass recognized what soldiers on the ground had known from the start. You cannot occupy a country without interacting with its people, and those interactions would inevitably become personal, human, complex. The German women navigated this new reality with strategies ranging from desperation to dignity to something in between. Some sought relationships with American soldiers as survival tactics. These women called Veronicas in military slang, Friulines in polite company, and worse terms in less polite context-traded companionship for food, for protection, for access to the relative wealth that even ordinary American soldiers represented in a devastated economy. Historians debate the coercion inherent in such arrangements. Were these women making free choices, or were they driven by hunger so acute that choice became meaningless? The answer varied by individual circumstance, but the pattern was clear. Economic desperation created situations where German women and American soldiers entered into relationships that were transactional, emotional, exploitative, genuine, or all of these simultaneously. Other women maintained strict distance, refused interaction with occupation forces on principle. These women, particularly those whose husbands were prisoners or missing, or those whose families had suffered in the Allied bombing campaigns, saw any fraternization as betrayal. They called women who dated Americans veriter, traitors, subjected them to social ostracism, and sometimes physical violence. Still others, like Anna Becker, found themselves in a middle ground, grateful for American kindness while deeply conflicted about accepting it, wanting connection while fearing what it meant, trying to maintain dignity while acknowledging that survival required compromise. Anna's relationship with James developed slowly through that summer of 1945. He visited every few days, always bringing food, sometimes bringing small gifts from Maria doll found in a damaged toy shop, colored pencils, a picture book in German that he'd traded cigarettes for with another soldier. The gifts weren't romantic gestures, at least not primarily, but acts of care for a child who'd lost her childhood to war. They communicated better as weeks passed. Anna learned English rapidly, motivated by necessity and intelligence that had made her an excellent teacher before bombs turned schools into rubble. James learned German more slowly, but his attempts amused Anna and Maria, made them laugh at his pronunciation, created moments of normalcy in circumstances profoundly abnormal. Fischer, the German-American medic, continued to visit occasionally, serving as translator for more complex conversations. Through him, James learned more about Anna's experiences, the bombing raids where she'd huddled in cellars with Maria, certain they would die. The food shortages that had made her consider possibilities she'd never thought she'd face. The casual cruelties of occupying Soviet soldiers in the brief period before Americans had taken control of Munich terrors she wouldn't describe in detail, but whose effects lingered in her nightmares and her daughter as fear of uniforms. James shared his own story more gradually, told her about Brooklyn, about working in his father's accounting office, about being drafted and trained and shipped overseas to fight a war he'd barely understood at first, about liberating the camp, about what he'd seen there, about how those images had made him understand why this war had been necessary, but also why he could have let that necessity make him cruel. "We fought to stop something evil," he said through Fischer's translation. "But if fighting evil makes us evil, what was the point?" Anna understood. She'd lived under a government that had normalized cruelty, had watched good people become complicit through small compromises that accumulated into catastrophe. She'd lost her husband to that system, had seen her city destroyed by it. The fact that James recognized the danger of becoming what he fought against, that recognition mattered more than she could express in her still halting English. By August, James was spending most of his free time at Anna's apartment. Not romantically, not yet, but as friend, as helper, as presence. He helped repair the ceiling where it had partially collapsed. He brought lumber and nails acquired through military channels. He taught Maria to play American card games. He read to her in English, helping both mother and daughter improve their language skills. The other soldiers in James's unit noticed. Some approved good for Sullivan, helping those people, showing them Americans weren't monsters. Others disapproved too friendly with the enemy, forgetting what Germans had done, risking security for some Frühling. His sergeant, a practical man from Texas named Lawson, pulled James aside one evening. "I know what you're doing," Lawson said. "Understand why. Hell, I'm doing similar things in my sector. But be careful. There are still true believers in the officer corps who think fraternization undermines discipline. Keep it quiet. Keep it appropriate. And for God's sake, don't get her pregnant." The warning was well-intentioned and prescient. By fall 1945, relationships between American soldiers and German women had become commonplace enough to generate official concern. Some officers worried about security pillow talk compromising military information. Others worried about morality soldiers forming attachments to enemy women while wives waited faithfully at home. Still others worried about illegitimate children, about the administrative complications of American soldiers fathering German babies who would need support, but whose mothers couldn't marry Americans under existing law. The concerns were valid, but also largely irrelevant. The relationships happened anyway, driven by loneliness, by attraction, by the fundamental human need for connection that persisted despite orders and complications and potential consequences. James and Anna's relationship crossed from friendship to romance sometime in September. Neither could pinpoint the exact moment. It developed gradually, naturally, through accumulated hours of conversation and laughter and shared meals. Through James teaching Maria to ride the bicycle he'd found and repaired. Through Anna mending James's uniform and sewing buttons with precision that came from years of making clothing last. Through small gestures that built into something neither had planned, but both found themselves unable to resist. Their first kiss happened in the kitchen of Anna's apartment. Late evening, Maria already asleep. They'd been washing dishes, a domestic scene so normal it felt surreal in the context of occupation and ruin. Anna said something in German that James didn't quite catch. He asked her to repeat it. She did, slower, and he realized she was thanking him, not just for the food or the help, but for treating her like a person, for seeing her. He kissed her gently, giving her opportunity to pull away. She didn't. Instead, she kissed him back with an intensity that spoke of loneliness and loss, and the desperate need to feel something other than fear and grief. They separated, both slightly stunned. Anna spoke in German, words tumbling fast. James caught maybe half something about wrong, about dangerous, about impossible, but also something about wanting, about needing, about choosing to take this risk, despite knowing all the reasons it was complicated. "I know," James said in English. "I know it's complicated, but I care about you. About Maria. About this. About us, if there can be an us." Anna understood enough, nodded, kissed him again, softer this time, more certain. Relationships between American soldiers and German women existed in a complex web of regulations, social pressures, and practical difficulties. For James and Anna, these complications manifested daily. The military officially discouraged serious relationships. Soldiers were rotated regularly, preventing long-term attachments. Marriage to German nationals was prohibited. Federal law barred servicemen from bringing enemy national wives to America. The policy was explicit. You could date a German woman, but you couldn't marry her, and you certainly couldn't take her home when your service ended. This created painful situations. Soldiers who fell genuinely in love faced impossible choices: stay in Germany after discharge, abandoning career and family in America, or leave their German partners behind with whatever consequences followed. For women who became pregnant in thousands, the complications multiplied. American soldiers could acknowledge paternity, could provide some support through military channels, but couldn't legitimize the child through marriage or provide the security that would come from American citizenship. Anna and James navigated these realities carefully. They kept their relationship relatively private, avoiding displays that would attract official attention. James continued to live in military housing, but spent most free time at Anna's apartment. She maintained public discretion, aware that German women who dated Americans faced harassment from other Germans called traitors, sometimes attacked, subjected to humiliating rituals like having their heads shaved. The social pressure worked both directions. James faced subtle but real discrimination from some fellow soldiers who viewed his relationship as betrayal, not of military orders, which everyone violated, but of racial and national solidarity. There were men in his unit who'd lost brothers or friends in combat, who couldn't forgive Germans collectively, who saw James's relationship with Anna as dishonoring those deaths. One evening in October, 3 soldiers from another unit confronted James as he walked to Anna's apartment. They were drunk, belligerent, looking for a target for rage that had no proper outlet, called him crowd lover, called Anna worse, pushed him. One threw a punch that James barely dodged. The fight was brief. James had some boxing training, and the soldiers were too drunk to be effective. But it was vicious while it lasted, driven by genuine hatred that frightened James more than the physical violence. They weren't fighting him over military discipline or orders. They were fighting him for choosing to see humanity in people they needed to see as enemies. Sergeant Lawson broke it up, sent the other soldiers away with threats of charges, helped James to his feet. "You can't change how they think," Lawson said. Too much anger. Too much loss. Some men need enemies, or they don't know who they are anymore. James understood, but disagreed. That's exactly what we have to change, he replied. Or we'll just create the conditions for the next war. The incident shook Anna badly. James had told her about it. Keeping secrets seemed worse than sharing difficulty. She worried for his safety, felt guilt that her presence in his life created danger, questioned whether they should continue the relationship. Maria had already lost her father. Anna couldn't bear the thought of the child losing James too, of more violence in a life already saturated with it. They talked through the night, speaking in the mixed German and English that had become their private language. James insisted he was choosing this, choosing her, choosing to build rather than destroy. Anna insisted she couldn't ask him to sacrifice his standing in the military, his relationships with fellow soldiers, his future plans for something that might be temporary. This isn't temporary, James said with certainty that surprised them both. I don't know how we'll navigate the regulations. Don't know if the law will change, or we'll find some loophole, or what. But I know I want a future with you and Maria. Know I want to build something here that matters. Anna cried, not from sadness, but from relief so profound it felt like pain. She'd been alone so long, responsible for everything, carrying weight she'd thought would crush her. The possibility of partnership, of shared burden, of love, it felt too precious to believe and too necessary to doubt. Through winter 1945-46, their relationship deepened despite complications. James proposed in January, even though marriage was illegal, presenting it as promise rather than immediate possibility. Anna accepted, also knowing it was symbolic, but symbols mattered. They represented intention, commitment, hope for a future that current law said couldn't exist. The ring was improvised a piece of silver James had shaped himself, engraved with their initials. It fit imperfectly, but meant everything. Anna wore it on a chain around her neck, hidden under clothing where official eyes wouldn't see and official policies couldn't reach. They weren't alone in this situation. Thousands of American soldiers had formed relationships with German women, faced similar complications, waited for regulations to change, or found creative workarounds. Some soldiers extended their service in Germany, postponing inevitable separation. Others were discharged and stayed in Europe as civilians, finding work with occupation authorities or civilian agencies. Still others left Germany with promises to return, to sponsor immigration once laws changed, to maintain relationships across an ocean through letters that took weeks to arrive and carry news already outdated. The broader context was changing rapidly. Germany was being rebuilt, reorganized, integrated into the emerging Cold War framework. The Western zones under American, British, and French control were merging into what would become West Germany. The Marshall Plan was being developed, promising massive economic aid to rebuild Europe, including former enemies. The focus was shifting from punishment to reconstruction, from occupation to alliance against the growing Soviet threat. These geopolitical shifts had personal implications. As Germany transformed from enemy to potential ally, restrictions on relationships eased. The soldiers of 1945 who couldn't marry German women found that by 1947 the laws were changing. Public sentiment in America was evolving. Initial hostility to German marriages softened as Cold War priorities redefined who counted as enemy and who counted as friend. James and Anna waited. They built a life together within the constraints possible, created routines that felt like marriage even without legal recognition. James was effectively a stepfather to Maria, teaching her English, helping with homework, being present in ways her biological father never had been because war had taken him before she could form memories. They lived cautiously, aware that James could be transferred at any time, that orders could separate them, that the temporary nature of occupation meant nothing was permanent. But they also lived fully, choosing to embrace the present while working toward a future they couldn't guarantee. In spring 1946, James's unit was scheduled for rotation back to the United States. The orders came with 3 months' notice, sufficient time to make arrangements, insufficient time to resolve the legal complications that prevented Anna from accompanying him. They discussed options frantically. James could extend his service, volunteer for continued occupation duty. He could leave the military and remain in Germany as civilian. Anna could wait in Munich while James returned to America, hoping he could sponsor her immigration once laws changed. They could abandon their relationship, accept that circumstances had defeated them, go their separate ways with whatever scars the choice would leave. None of the options were good. James decided to extend his service. It was the only choice that didn't involve separation or abandoning his commitment to Anna and Maria. He signed papers volunteering for continued occupation duty, accepting assignment in the civil administration that was beginning to transfer authority to German institutions under American oversight. His sergeant was not surprised, knew about Anna, approved of James's choice. Lots of boys making similar decisions, Lawson said. Building lives here. Can't say I blame them. War destroys things. Someone has to rebuild. Might as well be us. To understand the full complexity of relationships between American soldiers and German women requires centering the women's experiences, their choices and constraints, their agency and vulnerability. Anna's story was one of millions. German women in 1945-48 faced situations unprecedented in modern European history. They constituted 60% of the adult population in occupied zones, a massive gender imbalance created by male deaths and imprisonment. This meant women bore responsibility for almost all civilian reconstruction work, clearing rubble, planting crops, operating businesses, maintaining families, rebuilding society from ruins while grieving losses that were personal, familial, and national. The American occupation brought both relief and complication. Relief because American zones were comparatively well managed, well supplied, committed to eventually rebuilding German civil society. Complication because the presence of foreign soldiers created situations where power imbalances, economic desperation, and human attraction intersected in ways that were difficult to navigate ethically or emotionally. Some German women's experiences with American soldiers were unambiguously positive. They found partners who treated them with respect, who contributed to family survival, who offered not just material support, but emotional connection during impossibly difficult times. These relationships, when genuine, provided hope that healing was possible, that enemies could become friends, that individuals could transcend the categories nations placed them in. Other women's experiences were exploitative. Economic desperation created situations where consent was complicated at best. American soldiers had access to food, cigarettes, chocolate, nylons, commodities that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Some soldiers used this economic leverage to obtain physical relationships that might not have existed absent desperation. These situations occurred within technically legal frameworks, but raised serious questions about ethics, consent, and the power dynamics inherent in occupation. Still, other women experienced violence. While American forces had relatively good discipline compared to Soviet occupation troops, incidents of mistreatment occurred. Military records document courts-martial for soldiers who committed violence against German civilians. The American military justice system prosecuted such cases, unlike in some other occupation zones, but prosecution didn't prevent the violence or heal its victims. The women who formed relationships with American soldiers faced judgment from multiple directions. Other Germans viewed them with hostility, seen as traitors who consorted with the enemy, while German men suffered in prisoner camps. American military authorities viewed them with suspicion, potential security risks, gold diggers seeking immigration, women of questionable morality. Even well-meaning Americans often patronized them, assumed their relationships were transactional rather than genuine, questioned whether German women could truly love American men or were simply using them. Anna experienced all these judgments. Her neighbors whispered, called her Ami Liebchen behind her back. One woman spat at her in a bread line, called her traitor, accused her of dishonoring her dead husband. Anna wanted to explain that she'd mourned her husband, that she'd been faithful to his memory for 2 years, that she was choosing life rather than endless grief, that James was good to Maria, that survival sometimes required accepting help from people you'd once called enemies. But explanations felt futile. People who needed to judge would judge regardless. So Anna endured the whispers, held her head high, focused on building a life that made sense to her, even if it offended other sensibilities. The judgment from Americans was different, but equally wounding. Some of James's fellow soldiers assumed Anna was with him for material benefit, the food, the protection, the possibility of American immigration. They didn't see the late-night conversations, the shared laughter, the genuine affection. Didn't understand that Maria called James Papa James because he was present and caring in ways her biological father had never had opportunity to be. Didn't recognize that Anna had chosen James not from desperation, but from seeing in him the kind of man she wanted in her life and her daughter's life. Through 1946 and into 1947, Anna rebuilt her life with James's help. She returned to teaching. Schools were reopening, desperately needed teachers, and her skills were valuable. The work was meaningful, paid poorly but regularly, gave her identity beyond being James's German woman. She taught children whose fathers were missing or dead, whose homes were rubble, whose psychological wounds would take decades to heal. She taught them mathematics and literature and history, carefully edited to acknowledge Germany as crimes without crushing the children under guilt they had unearned. Maria thrived. At 8, then 9, she was becoming bilingual, switching between German and English with ease. She adored James, had bonded with him in ways that made Anna's heart ache with gratitude and residual grief for the father Maria would never know. The child was healing, laughing, playing, reclaiming childhood in increments. Other women in Anna's situation formed informal support networks. They met in parks, at markets, shared information about navigating military bureaucracy, discussed rumors about changing immigration laws, offered each other solidarity in the face of social ostracism. These networks were practical and emotional lifelines, spaces where women could acknowledge the complexity of their situations without judgment. Some women in these networks had married American soldiers through military chaplains, ceremonies that held religious but not legal validity until laws changed. Others were engaged like Anna, waiting for regulations to permit formal marriage. Still others had relationships they described as temporary, knowing the soldier would eventually leave, accepting limited-term arrangements that provided current support without future commitment. The women shared information about which American units were reliable, which commanding officers were sympathetic, which bureaucratic pathways might expedite immigration applications when they became possible. They warned each other about soldiers who'd made promises to multiple women, who had wives in America they hadn't mentioned, who were using German women without intention of commitment. The network Anna participated in included Greta, whose American soldier had been transferred back to the States with promises to sponsor her immigration that proved empty. Greta was left pregnant, unsupported, facing social condemnation and economic hardship. The women pooled resources to help her: food, clothing for the coming baby, assistance finding work that would accommodate pregnancy and single motherhood. There was Helga, whose relationship with an American lieutenant was genuine but complicated by his existing marriage. He was divorcing his American wife, claimed he'd been honest with both women about the situation, but the divorce process was slow and uncertain. Helga waited in limbo, emotionally committed but legally unrecognized, hoping circumstances would resolve favorably, but unable to count on it. There was Christina, whose soldier had died in a vehicle accident before they could marry. She'd loved him genuinely, been loved in return, but his death left her with nothing, no legal relationship, no survivor benefits, no recognition of what they'd been to each other. She mourned alone, her grief validated by friends, but invisible to official systems. These women's stories illustrated the enormous variation in relationships between American soldiers and German women. Some were exploitation. Some were genuine love. Most were complicated mixtures transactions that became emotional, affairs that became commitments, survival strategies that evolved into partnerships. What united them was navigating a situation none had chosen, created by wars and occupations and geopolitical forces beyond individual control. They were making choices, real choices, even if constrained by circumstances about how to survive, how to rebuild, whom to trust, what futures to reach for. In December 1946, Congress passed Public Law 471, permitting American servicemen to bring foreign spouses to the United States. The law was primarily intended for soldiers who'd married British women during the war, but it applied to all foreign nationals, including Germans. By summer 1947, the restrictions that had prevented James and Anna from marrying were lifted. They married in August 1947 in a civil ceremony in Munich, with military witnesses and German friends present. Anna wore a dress she made herself from fabric James had obtained through military channels, white, as tradition demanded, simple as circumstances required. Maria served as flower girl, serious in her responsibility, glowing with happiness that her mother and Papa James were making official what had long been true in daily life. The ceremony was brief, conducted in German and English, binding in both languages. When James kissed his bride, when he lifted Maria in his arms and called her daughter, when Anna cried tears that were joy rather than grief, moments were small victories against the machinery of war, private triumphs, asserting that individuals could build across the ruins of nations. The immigration process was complex but navigable. Anna and Maria needed medical examinations, security clearances, documentation proving they weren't threats to American security. The bureaucracy was tedious, but designed to be completable, unlike the Soviet zone, where such immigration was essentially impossible, where women who'd formed relationships with Soviet soldiers faced abandonment when those soldiers were transferred home. In October 1947, Anna and Maria boarded a ship bound for New York. James had been discharged, had secured a job with an accounting firm in Brooklyn, had found an apartment large enough for his new family. They were going home, though, for Anna and Maria. Home was becoming something portable, defined by family rather than location. The Atlantic crossing took 8 days. Anna stood on deck as the ship approached New York Harbor, holding Maria's hand, watching the Statue of Liberty emerge from morning mist. She thought about arriving in Germany, about ruins and hunger, about hiding in a closet, terrified of what conquering soldiers would do, about James setting down his rifle and offering chocolate, about small kindnesses that accumulated into transformation. She thought about the other women in Germany, those waiting for laws to change, those abandoned by soldiers who'd returned to American wives, those raising children alone without support or recognition. She was lucky, privileged. She'd found a good man in terrible circumstances, and circumstances had ultimately permitted them to build something together. But luck wasn't the complete story. She'd chosen James after careful observation, had assessed his character through months of interaction, had chosen to trust despite having been given every reason to distrust. She'd worked to learn English, to understand American culture, to prepare herself and Maria for this transition. She'd maintained her dignity and teaching career, even while navigating the complicated ethics of occupation relationships. The ship docked. They disembarked into a country Anna had learned about through James's stories, but had never seen. A nation that had been her country's enemy, but was now her home. The customs process was lengthy, but professional. Officials were courteous, welcoming even, recognizing that war brides were becoming common enough to warrant dedicated processing. James waited beyond the customs barrier, grinning, bouncing on his toes with nervous energy. When they were released, he swept Anna into his arms, lifted Maria, crushed them both in an embrace that communicated what words couldn't. They'd made it. Against regulations and complications and an ocean of difficulties, they'd made it. Brooklyn welcomed them with autumn leaves and neighborhood curiosity. James's family was complicated. His mother was welcoming, his father skeptical, his sisters fascinated by the German sister-in-law and niece, who appeared speaking accented English. The neighborhood was a mix, some people friendly, others cold, many uncertain how to treat a German woman in a community where nearly every family had sent sons to war. Anna navigated it with the same dignity she'd shown in Munich. She was polite, patient, determinedly cheerful in the face of suspicion. She enrolled Maria in the local school, found part-time work tutoring, learned to cook American foods while teaching her mother-in-law German recipes. She integrated herself into the community through small, persistent efforts, proving through daily behavior that she was mother, wife, neighbor, that her nationality was one aspect of her identity, but not its totality. Not every war bride's story ended so positively. Anna maintained correspondence with women from the Munich network, learned of their varying fates. Some marriages succeeded, families thriving despite having formed under unusual circumstances. Other marriages failed, cultural differences too great, psychological wounds too deep. The soldiers who'd seemed kind in Germany, revealing themselves as troubled or abusive in America. Some women never made it to America at all. Immigration required sponsorship, required money for passage, required the soldier to follow through on promises that were easy to make in occupied Germany, but difficult to honor once back in the States. Letters went unanswered. Promised support never materialized. Women were left raising mixed-race children in a Germany that viewed them with hostility, without resources or recognition. The children wore babies, occupation children numbered in the hundreds of thousands across Europe. In Germany alone, an estimated 200,000 children were born to German mothers and Allied soldiers. These children grew up navigating complicated identities, claimed by neither father's country nor mother's fully, bearing visible proof of occupation relationships that both countries preferred to forget. Anna's awareness of these other stories tempered her gratitude for her own circumstances. She volunteered with organizations helping war brides adjust to America, translated documents, offered advice, provided emotional support. She sponsored other women when she could, using whatever limited influence she had to help navigate the system she'd successfully traversed. James and Anna Sullivan lived in Brooklyn for the rest of their lives. They had 2 more children, a son born in 1949, a daughter born in 1951. Maria grew up American but German, bilingual and bicultural, eventually becoming a teacher like her mother. She married, had children, maintained connections to both sides of her heritage. James returned to Germany several times, bringing Anna and the children to visit relatives, to show them where their parents' story had begun. The ruins of Munich had been rebuilt, transformed into a modern city where bomb damage was increasingly difficult to spot. The past was marked by memorials, but not by physical scars. Germany had rebuilt itself with thoroughness that sometimes made the war seem more distant than it was. Anna returned to Germany with mixed emotions. It was home and not home, familiar and foreign. Her mother's grave was tended by distant cousins. Her father's apartment building had been completely rebuilt, no trace of where she'd hidden in a closet when James found her. The city was prosperous, democratic, integrated into Western Europe, nothing like the ruins of 1945. She reconnected with some women from the Munich network. Greta had married a German man, raised her daughter with occasional support from the American father, who Dee eventually acknowledged paternity, but never formed a relationship. Helga's American lieutenant had completed his divorce, married her, brought her to California, where they raised 3 children. Christina had never remarried, had built a life as a teacher, had carried her lost love as private grief. The stories varied, but they shared common thread: survival against odds, resilience in face of judgment. The complex navigation of relationships formed an occupation as liminal space, where power and need and genuine connection intersected in ways that resisted simple moral categories. By the 1960s, the war babies were reaching adulthood. Some searched for fathers they'd never known, using fragmentary information to track American soldiers through military records and veteran organizations. Some found fathers who were shocked, repentant, eager to connect. Others found fathers who denied paternity, wanted nothing to do with these inconvenient reminders of wartime behavior. Still others found nothing: records incomplete, soldiers deceased, trails cold after 2 decades. The occupation relationships that had seemed so scandalous in the 1940s were largely forgotten by the 1970s. Germany and America were allied against the Soviet Union, and wartime animosities had been subordinated to Cold War alignments. War brides were simply immigrants, their German origins unremarkable in an America built on immigration. But the individuals remembered. Anna remembered the taste of James's chocolate, the moment she decided to trust him, the long, uncertain months, wondering if their relationship could survive regulations designed to prevent it. James remembered the terror in her eyes when he'd found her, the courage it had taken for her to accept his help, the partnership they'd built from such unpromising circumstances. Maria remembered Papa James reading to her in English, teaching her to ride a bicycle, being present in ways that made her biological father's absence bearable. She remembered her mother's strength, the way Anna had navigated impossible situations with dignity and determination, had built a life from ruins. James Sullivan died in 1982 at 60. Anna lived another 20 years, dying in 2002 at 81. At her funeral, 3 generations gathered: American grandchildren who knew Germany only through stories, great-grandchildren for whom World War II was ancient history, and Maria, who bridged all the generations, carrying memory of both sides. In her eulogy, Maria spoke about her mother's courage, spoke about surviving war and occupation and immigration, about building a life that spanned 2 countries and 3 languages, about the quiet heroism of daily persistence in the face of circumstances that could have crushed someone with less strength. She spoke about her father, too, about James choosing to see humanity where orders said he should see only enemies, about small kindnesses that proved transformative, about love finding paths even through regulations designed to prevent it. The story of American soldiers and German women after World War II is too large and varied for any single narrative to contain. There were thousands of James and Anna stories, relationships that formed an occupation's difficult space, that navigated complex ethics and practical barriers, that sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed, but always involved real people making real choices in extraordinary circumstances. Some of those relationships were exploitative. Some were genuine. Most contained elements of both, starting as transactions, becoming emotional, evolving into commitments that neither party had initially anticipated. To moralize them simplistically, to call them all romantic or all exploitative, is to miss the actual complexity of human behavior in extreme situations. What the successful relationships proved was that even enemies could become family, that individuals could transcend national categories, that rebuilding after catastrophic war required seeing the humanity in former adversaries. James's choice to set down his rifle and offer chocolate, Anna's choice to trust despite having every reason not to, these choices, multiplied thousands of times across occupied Germany, were the human foundation upon which official reconciliation was built. The policy implications were significant. The relationships between soldiers and German women created pressure that changed immigration laws, that forced military and civilian authorities to recognize that occupation wasn't just geopolitical abstraction, but involved actual people forming actual connections. The approximately 15,000 German war brides who immigrated to America in the late 1940s and 1950s were a small fraction of total German immigration, but were significant in changing American perceptions of Germany from enemy to potential ally. The children, those 200,000 occupation children, carried forward the biological reality of connections their countries preferred to minimize. They forced both America and Germany to acknowledge that war's aftermath included these tangible human consequences, that policy abstractions had produced actual lives that required accommodation. The women who formed relationships with American soldiers navigated situations where power imbalances, economic desperation, genuine attraction, and survival necessity all intersected. To honor their experiences requires acknowledging complexity, neither romanticizing these relationships into simple love stories, nor reducing them to pure exploitation, but recognizing them as human responses to inhuman circumstances, choices made with constrained options, survival strategies that sometimes evolved into genuine partnerships. Anna Becker Sullivan's story represents one path through this complexity. She survived war, occupation, immigration, and decades of building a life across cultures. She maintained her dignity, raised her children, contributed to her communities in both Germany and America. She transformed from enemy civilian to American citizen through choices both she and James made, choices that were brave, practical, loving, strategic, and human. Her story, and thousands like it, proves that even after catastrophic war, even between enemies, even in situations structured by vast power imbalances, individuals can choose connection over continuation of hostility, can build families across the ruins of nations, can prove that the human capacity for compassion and rebuilding exceeds the capacity for destruction, if barely, if conditionally, if with enormous effort. That is how American soldiers treated German women after World War II, with the full range of human behavior, from criminality to exploitation to indifference, to kindness to genuine love. The best of them chose to see humanity where policy suggested they see only enemies, chose to offer help where regulations said they should maintain distance, chose to build where destruction would have been easier. And some German women chose to accept that help, to trust those offers, to build those connections despite having every historical reason to be suspicious. Chose survival and eventually chose more than survival, chose partnership, chose love, chose futures that seemed impossible in May 1945 when the war ended and the occupation began. This is their story, complicated, difficult, human, neither wholly romantic nor wholly dark. Just people navigating impossible circumstances with whatever grace and courage they could muster, building lives from ruins, proving that even enemies can become family if individuals choose connection over continued hostility.